don't really know how this is going to how is this going to be like structured. I know you have the PowerPoints and all that. So
I usually do PowerPoints, but I thought we'd just talk. So I think we're good now,
okay,
and I don't edit. So anyway, I'll introduce
yeah,
you. So I'm here with Kevin Doremus, the Great. We're talking about an article today called "Why Washington Doesn't Debate Grand Strategy." So Kevin, you want to start off, and we'll talk about what just for maybe people who are entering this at kind of a more basic level, just in the sense of what a grand strategy is, and then we'll talk about this article from is it from Cato about
no,
why they don't debate it, why Washington doesn't debate it. So you want to explain what a
so
grand strategy
a
is?
grand strategy, just like a big foreign policy plan of like what are our national interests, kind of defining all of these different aspects. So there's two big variants in the grand strategy debate. One is restraint, the other one is primacy. And today we'll be talking more about the primacy aspects,
Yeah,
and is also known as liberal hegemony in a sense. So,
right,
and why is it debated? It's primarily because of we live in a more progressive liberal society, and primacy advocates for this kind of Wilsonian progressive idea of democratic peace, spreading global capitalism around the world, global democracy, and typically primacists kind of challenge restrainers on a more moral level. It's immoral to not want to see more democracy, more capitalism, more freedom around the world. You're
right,
Some people say, oh, you're allowing Assad to gas his people, allowing slave states, that type of thing.
right. So yeah, I just picked up on that recently. The idea of if liberalism is, and it's compelling on a surface level, that if liberalism is universal rights, and we all have these universal rights not to be enslaved, not to have capitalism, to have free markets, all this stuff. Well, then why wouldn't we export that? But then, at gunpoint, it becomes problematic and has some unintended consequences, obviously. Uh, just a sec. Let me see if my. I'll make sure I'm still okay. Yeah, we're still good. Okay. Um, make sure I can see you here. Let me get this out of the way. Okay. So yeah, that's primacy and grand strategy, and yeah, the grand strategy of the United States since I don't know if I'd say since forever, since at least the 1950s, right? Since post World War II has been primacy, and that's been kind of the consensus view of even if you're on the left or the right politically, except for some exceptions, that's been the norm, right? You can't
Yes.
really, as this article talks about, you can't really debate.
Oh
Uh,
no, you can't.
well, you can, but you're going to get called an isolationist or a coward or a dove or a retreater. You get those
Well,
type
yeah.
of things. But anyway, so let's talk about how this primacy, why this position, this grand strategy in the U.S. Uh, doesn't get debated. Uh, because one of the quotes from this article, let me just read this quote here. It says, "So debate over grand strategy is nearly absent in U.S. politics," and it says it's generated bipartisan support for primacy, a grand strategy that sees U.S. global military dominance as the basis for U.S. security. So kind of strange in a lot of people's minds because they think the left and the right don't agree on anything, but they definitely agree on primacy, and for different reasons. So you want to go ahead and talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, because I mean, there's two like right and left primacy. The right has this more John Bolton unilateralist
Yeah,
primacy, where we don't need international institutions. The United States is kind of this messianic being that can spread democracy around the world. And the more left version of liberal hegemony is the belief in international institutions and the combination of U.S. power with institutions. That's how we can spread global capitalism, democracy, and so forth.
right. So yeah, the even though
It's kind
the
of like just to be more current events. It's like what's happening with Switzerland with the European Union. I don't know if you followed that, where all these trade agreements are now ending, and now the European Union is telling Switzerland, okay, to continue our trading partnership, you have to adopt all these different regulations to continue our partnership.
Oh, you gotta
And
love that.
so
So no, I wasn't
it's
following that. I'm more of a Middle East guy right now, but yeah, that's the type of thing. Is like the right, they hate the UN, they hate the and rightly so. I think they hate the right thing for the wrong reasons in a lot of cases. But then the left, they like the UN. They want this internationalism, um, or liberalism in the international relations sense, that okay, we'll get everybody talking, but also we're going to have international law and try to make the system not anarchy, which that's in uh, not anarchy in chaos terms, anarchy in international relations terms. It is there's no one world government. But let me read a quote from this article. It's exactly what you brought up, that they have the different kind of view on this from the left and the right, but it kind of ends up in the same range of what what type of policies are available. And they point to an example of the Iraq War in 2003. So what were the different reasons for going to the Iraq War? So for the left, the liberal internationalists, the democratic premises, their reason is to go in for human rights, for the rights of women, to bring Iraq in line with the goals of the UN. And then for the Hawks, the neoconservatives, the hawkish nationalists, the Republicans, it's because of weapons of mass destruction and uh, American
nuclear
national
proliferation.
security, taking out Hitler and that one Hitler after another. And I've heard it said, I don't remember who said this, but it's like the range of foreign policy uh, between the left and the right is, do we want to sanction the people to death or do we want to bomb them? Like it's just, then the sanctions of course being on the left and the bombing being on the right, and that's our options. But it's like, well, okay, so those are our only options. uh, but how did that system develop, in which you only have two options that they end in the same result, but they just come at it from different reasons? We don't really have a lot of debate on the subject. Why is that the case?
You have all these, well, as the article points out, you have all these think tanks that are beholden to their donors. And so the debate's more about how do we implement these policies of primacy instead of, well, we're in the academic part where it talks about, well, there is actually debate. There's Stephen Wall, John Milsheimer. They're challenging the liberal hegemonic policies, but they're not in, the think tanks in DC. And that's where all kind of like a conveyor belt, like people from the Obama administration, they go to the Wilson Center or CSIS or Brookings. Then the Trump people come in, and then they just rotate. Just
Right.
and so there's no real debate between all these different groups because generally, right, who's backing these think tanks, right? Whether it's government grants or military-industrial complex. So if these people write articles that are critical of U.S. foreign policy,
Then you
well,
don't have a job, right?
yeah,
Or they're not going to want to invite you to write another article.
yeah, but it's even coming to academia too, where now regarding grants, you can't write certain things if it's critical or not critical of certain aspects of U.S. foreign policy. So now it's coming that how the process works in the think tank world is now coming to academics.
you got
So
you got to love that, like, because that's an aspect I hadn't even appreciated until fairly recently. I don't know if you remember this, but this has nothing to do with foreign policy, but it reflects the same type of thing, that these this group of liberals was putting together fake uh, academic papers to send in, to these,
right,
universities, and see if they would accept them. And they put in outrageous things, like, all kinds of things about like rape culture at dog parks and all this stuff. But and they got accepted, or they read the comments of the reviewers of the things. They're like, well, it didn't accept it because it didn't talk about this or that uh, fashionable political opinion. But then it didn't occur to me until someone else brought it up that a lot of this stuff is funded, like you say, through through grants, through actual taxpayer money that's handed to the government and then given to these colleges, these universities, uh, that are receiving this government money to write this stuff. And it's even worse with the think tanks because it's a little bit more uh, direct in that stuff. It's the supply uh, rises to meet the demand of, okay, we want this stuff, so you go out and be apologists for this type of view, then you're going to get a job, then you're going to be invited into these circles. And then when presidents, there's an article, I think it was Patrick Porter on, you may have sent it to me, it was on uh, the foreign policy establishment elite, and I think I did a video on it previously, that was when presidents choose their advisors, they're all coming from this set of people from think tanks. It's never
That conveyor belt.
right. And so whether it's like you said, Trump choosing advisors or Clinton or Bush, they're all choosing within the same range of this foreign policy establishment elite, which is creepy. I hadn't thought about that until
There's a
recently.
good there's another article like who delivers doves or hawks to the Cambridge International Affairs. And essentially, their argument is Democratic candidates, like across the whole liberal democratic world, really you can't take what they have to say with foreign policy because it's about who they hire that dictates the foreign policy. So when you see, a lot of people are hype about, Tulsi Gabbard or even Donald Trump when he was running,
Right.
really everyone got all hype. Oh, look, he's going to bring some change. But then you start seeing who they hired and how much of a difference is there between, Bush's policy, Obama's policy, now even Trump's. Granted, Trump's is a little bit more restrained than
Right.
Obama's because he did more he put on a show more or less.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's a great point. Is what I've brought up with people. People, uh, I work at a school, and we discuss, and Trump obviously comes up at a lot in education. People tend to be a little more liberal, and I'm not for Trump either, but bring up Trump a lot, and they're like, oh, this white national, all this stuff, and I'm like, well, you realize the foreign policy of our last, I don't know, 8 presidents has been within a range of fairly, fairly the same. But I think that's one of the big things that people don't realize. Exactly what you said is when someone like a Tulsi Gabbard comes out, or a Donald Trump, who actually questions that foreign policy in a serious way. Uh, I mean that's like the one thing you're really not supposed to question, right? Is the foreign policy stuff. You can do this or that or say that they made it like it was about Trump's tweets, but that even gets mentioned in the article that the reaction of Trump to him questioning NATO, suggesting that NATO, which was around for the sake of containing the Soviet Union, which no longer exists, that maybe we should not be following that pattern anymore and paying for the uh, defense of South Korea and Japan, modern wealthy nations
well,
that can handle themselves. But
it
people
goes back to
freaked out when Trump was running, right? And now, because once they started realizing that he was going to win, they started realizing Hillary Clinton would have been the same thing. But now Trump's, like you said, he hires all the worst people. I wish he knew guys like you were out there with the people who were like
I don't. There's no. This is here's goes into the article. Like people like me, you graduate, you do like internships, but then you can't get the experience to have that credibility,
right,
right? And that's what, regardless of what any restrainer when they become elected, when they pick people, they're going to have, if they really care, they would have to take a risk and pick people who don't have experience, which could either go really well or really badly.
right.
So
I mean, could you? I guess you have to. The Senate has to approve a lot of these people too, right? So I mean, yeah,
good luck with that, right? I mean, they would shut it down.
right. So I mean, if they picked Scott Horton, it's just how well would that go? He doesn't come from a think tank or something like that, which is it's really limiting now. It's I think that I didn't have a full appreciation for it. I don't think most people realize that. that this is like a, you have your court kind of apologists, your elite, that they like you said earlier, they only talk about implementation. They don't talk about whether or not we should do something or not do something. They just talk about, okay, well, when we do it, how are we going to do it? So the assumption is already uh,
The
built in.
ideology, everything's all set, and then we go. That's the one problem I have with the article. It doesn't really talk about like the ideological foundations preventing the debate from even happening,
Right.
right? Because that's the one criticism I have. It's very good piece, but it's that one aspect that I think because with John Mearsheimer's latest book that David Gordon and I wrote a review for,
Okay.
he attacks the liberal hegemonic idea at the core, which he blames as progressive liberalism. Which again, when you look back at history of U.S. foreign policy, right? What president signed off on, funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan? Who, meddled in the Balkans, and then or Obama in the Middle East, right? You begin to see,
Right.
oh, this so-called left-wing restrainers, they don't actually back up what they're saying.
Right.
People
It's
buy
not
into that a lot.
it's not the hawks, right? It's well, and they are hawks, but they're not the John Bolton, you know, uh, John McCain type of people on the right. They're they're willing to invade and bomb, like with Obama with Libya. Uh, they're willing to invade and bomb for what they feel like. If you're bombing someone for nice reasons, hey, I want them to have a nice, which the right does too, that we're freeing the world for democracy type of thing.
Well, have you heard of the book A Foreign Policy for the Left?
No, I haven't.
Oh yeah, you should read that. It's a guy who, I can't remember his name. He's a communitarian, but he's this big internationalist, and he's arguing, defending Obama's foreign policy, and we should have more of that.
Really?
So,
Man, that's a
and he shows how it's consistent with progressivism, which he's right.
which it is. That's the thing. It's like I brought up in foreign policy, and of course my foreign policy views. Um, I won't say offend, but they're at odds with a lot of my conservative friends and kind of the culture that I'm in. Not that it doesn't lead to some good discussion, but I don't know where I was going with this. But it's like it's not just the conservative. Oh, here's what I was gonna say. That it was. I sometimes say that the progressives are the interventionists at home, and the conservatives are the interventionists in foreign policy. But that's not even true anymore. Like everybody's an interventionist in everything now, with some notable exceptions. Like I don't think Ted Cruz wants to get that involved in something here at home, and he wants to abolish the IRS. But give him foreign policy, and everybody's an interventionist, even the left. Like it's not like the 60s hippie movement left that's anti-war and anti-Vietnam war and intervention there. It's okay, well, we've got to spread, and as I said, it has a compelling surface validity to it. We've got to spread at gunpoint these liberal values, rights for women, this type of thing.
They wouldn't say it that way, but they would make it more. They would appeal to the morality a lot more, to where people go, "Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, we should be helping people."
Right.
People want to be free, right? That's the what people want to be free.
Yeah, that's a hard one to fight, right? I mean, someone's under
except when you have universal values. Well, guess what? China has universal values. Russia has universal values. Do all those universal values all line up the same? Or does Confucianism match with what Western civilization is? It doesn't, right? So, and then that leads to a clash to war. You have to have a more pluralist take on the world. And okay, we have to be more tolerant and accept that the world's a multicultural space.
Yeah.
And not trying to be trying to have a homogenous world where you take a Western model and apply it across the world.
Sure. So let's stick on that for a minute and talk about the Christian way of thinking through. I mean, I won't say the Christian way of thinking, because Christians differ on these things, but in the sense of we're both believers. We both believe in that there is, a foundation for ethics that's biblical, and therefore it's universal. So what how do we talk to other Christians and differentiate between the fact that yes, we believe in a uh, universal ethics, and those rights and stuff that we do believe are universal rights, right? Not to have your property stolen, enslaved, be killed, those type of things. Those are universal human rights. But then, how do we make a differentiation between that and an aggressive foreign policy uh, to to accomplish those things?
I think there's kind of like this realist version. It's called Christian realism, which allows for people to have choice. Right, you're not trying to be hegemonic and be a messianic state, but instead you're allowing people on their own to choose. So, but then also it's this weird kind of caveat where like I'm still thinking about soft power, like how much role should missionaries have in the world? Because there's been some cases where missionaries have been used as a form of soft power to do other things that spread the gospel. So it's just that's what I'm wrestling with right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple thoughts I had on that, I guess, as you're talking, as I'm thinking through this question as well, is one, I mean, and this is kind of a throwaway. You can also look at the results. Like they told us, okay, Afghanistan was gonna, bring all these rights and things in for women, things that as Americans and as Christians we would agree with, but it didn't get better for women after they invaded Afghanistan, and so
It
you,
was never going to.
but it's like, right, it's not going to be the same. And now if Christianity did take hold in that culture, I think things could change there, but not at the point of a gun, at the point of a military
You have to be
base,
voluntary.
right? And also I think you brought up a great word that really comes from the ideas of Woodrow Wilson, even though he didn't, put it in these terms necessarily, but this messianic view of the American government. I remember this. Did you ever watch The Twilight Zone? Okay, well,
No,
there's this Twilight Zone, which made me think the maker of it may be a little bit sympathetic to libertarianism. But this lady's yelling, "The state is not God," and that idea that you can't are we spreading the gospel, or are we spreading American hegemony uh, and trying to make nations fall more in line with what's good for the American state, rather than, yeah, you're not going to be able to import values like that. And if you try, like, look at Afghanistan again, the you can go in with all the best intentions in a lot of ways, but you set up a government strong enough to hold power in that region, it's not going to be the type of government you know expect in the Western world. That the government the
different
U.S. set
culture.
up there is an illiberal government. It's a government that hires warlords that fight, pick people and fight their enemies and call them Al Qaeda and the Taliban, to try to get the Americans to fight the people they want them to fight. But anyway, so that's just something as a Christian to think through. Uh, so what are the results? Let's talk about that a little bit more. So this one's kind of,
Results of primacy?
yeah. So let's say,
Oh,
okay,
good.
well, primacy is our thing, and if what about American exceptionalism? America is this, unique nation, and and I don't debate some of that. That it's this unique nation, and it should try its best to fight bad things and stuff like that. And if it's kind of, wouldn't we want to have a good nation like America dictating the terms and providing, leadership in the world? That's kind of where, a lot of people are going to be coming to this from. But what are the actual results of primacy, and that stance from not just America, but if any big power, in a unipolar world where there's it's not like there's Soviet Union anymore. There's one big power that
Well,
has this
that's
military.
changing now, though.
Oh, really? You think that?
Yeah. No, you're seeing a bipolar world form. Well, a multipolar world in the regional sense, but a bipolar world forming
Okay,
at the
interesting.
moment. You're seeing because the United States, right, has one of the results from primacy destabilize the Middle East, results in a migration crisis into Europe, destabilizes the political aspects of all versions of European parliaments now, where you have the Brexit Party now is dominating European Parliament. You have rise of alternative right movements across nationalist movements, and you're seeing the center, like the center left and center right, they're hollowing out. That's just in the European context, but then primacy was in Latin America hasn't been successful either. Typically, as kind of Gareth Porter puts out, there's just a big trail of blood everywhere we go. But a lot of what primacists would argue is, but look how they kind of would point to human progress, or look how much the world has progressed since the end of the Cold War, which is true, but they never admit what about the places the U.S. has touched? Have they benefited at all from globalization, things like that?
Right.
But then going back to the bipolar aspect, you see now a rising China, which is what I think Peter Lavelle from RT and the Duran called the Eurasian Information Infrastructure, where now their Belt Road is a top-down system, which it won't work from just a libertarian perspective, but they're still developing it. They're using their Belt Road as like a PR campaign to bring people into their sphere of influence. And so now you have the Eastern European countries joining it with the 16+1 organization. You have Russia now cooperating with China. And then just today we saw, the German military is doing drills with the Chinese medical corps. So there's all these things. Look, Eastern European countries or NATO countries are now cooperating more with China than with the United States. And so people are going to be forced to choose which economic system you want to join. Do you want to join the neoliberal Washington consensus driven by Washington, or do you want to join the Chinese-Russian axis with their Eurasian information structure? So in a way, primacy has ruined the brand of liberalism. So now people are, well, I don't want to be a part of this system anymore. So China and Russia look like a good alternative,
for an
in their
alternative.
perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, every region is affected by American primacy, just like every region was affected during the Cold War, right? During the bipolar, fighting for primacy of the two major powers, the U.S. and Russia, or the Soviet Union, I guess I should say. But yeah, the destabilization. What a lot of people don't realize, there's the big thing on immigration, and are we importing, not importing, but allowing people in who might be terrorists or something from the Middle East to come through there and they're part of ISIS. And I don't buy into all that necessarily, but one of the things that has to be pointed out to people is, well, the reason why there's this migration crisis in Europe, and to a much lesser extent to the United States, is because their regions have been destabilized, like Libya in 2011. That Libya, just as an example, um, after Obama's drone wars there and the bombing, fully supported by Hillary Clinton and the State Department at the time, uh, totally destabilized the region and caused a bloody civil war. And Libya was not a great place to live by any means. It was a terrible place to live, but in terms of like Christianity, there was sort of a stable agreement that the Muslims and the Christians weren't fighting each other under the Gaddafi regime. But after he gets killed off, a power vacuum, is created there. Which, remember, Hillary Clinton celebrating that, we came, we saw, he died, and it's fallen and collapsed into a bloody civil war with Christians being killed, with people leaving Libya and trying to go somewhere else, which is not a refugee crisis at that point, because it's about war, right? A civil war is not a refugee issue necessarily. And then also they've reinstituted slavery, chattel slavery, and the slave trade in Libya. So all that from the U.S. intervention there, and then the thing that came out about it was the Benghazi thing, that, oh well, they attacked us on September 11th, but it was just a bunch of people attacking us because of an offensive video about the Prophet Muhammad. It wasn't about uh, the bombing and the intervention in Libya and what came from that. But that's just one example. And that's an example from there, and that's from an example from Obama. I mean, he at least questioned the Afghanistan war. He didn't back it up. He would have been in a unique position to end that war, but he didn't actually do it. So I mean, that's just one example in the Middle East of how primacy can totally disrupt um, a whole region. So
Yeah, it's a hell of good intentions, as Stephen Walt calls it.
a hell of good intention. That's a good. What else? What else about primacy? I'm trying to look through my notes here.
I mean, they have this belief that we can somehow achieve nuclear proliferation, which, from a restraint perspective, seems ridiculous because
Nuclear
nuclear weapons.
non-proliferation or proliferation?
Yeah, they don't want nukes around. They fear nuclear proliferation.
Oh, okay. Right.
So
So they
from a restraint perspective, nukes are the great equalizer. Right? If Ukraine had nukes, would Russia have taken Crimea? Or because look at North Korea, right? It's just this hermit kingdom that just have nuclear capabilities. They're still around. China
yeah,
hasn't invaded, or South Korea, the United States hasn't invaded. And so, and then Iran, they look really dumb because they decided, that, oh, we'll go negotiate with Obama and we'll have this great nuclear deal. But the United States is a democracy, so every 4 years there's an election. So new leadership comes in, tears up the agreement. Now they have nothing to negotiate with. It's like
right.
you may have wanted to have something to negotiate with, so then you wouldn't be in a situation where now they're backed into a corner.
Right. Well, and then we accuse them of breaking the agreement that the U.S. left. It's like, well, yeah, it's not part of an agreement if the one party leaves. It's like, but you're
But
right about North Korea. Remember the new axis of evil by George Bush. He goes Iraq, Iran, and then he threw in North Korea, which North Korea is an evil regime. We're not debating that, but we went and invaded Iraq. Well, you better believe, and it looks like we could invade. I don't necessarily think we will. I hope not. It could invade Iran, but where we haven't invaded and we've negotiated with is North Korea. Why? They have nuclear weapons and they saw what happened to Iraq and they're seeing what happened to Iran. So you better believe everyone's like, Kim Jong Un is crazy, all this stuff. Oh, yeah, but crazy and irrational are sometimes conflated. You have to put it in the context of what these people are seeing and thinking. If they think the U.S. is going to invade and take over and do what they did to Iraq, then of course you're gonna, it's worth it to take the risk of getting a nuke. But it's also, Japan's supposed to not have a military, right? South Korea is not supposed to have a military, so we have to be responsible for them balancing out that region, right?
we've institutionalized our presence.
Right. Yeah. There's no way for us not to leave right now, right? Because if we did, North Korea would come and get you guys. Is the is the idea, but also it's hey, you need us here. You don't want us to, but also we don't want you to build nukes. That's crazy talk.
But more than likely, they'll just fall into the Chinese sphere of influence over time.
Yeah.
So, as according to David Kang, so I think that's what will happen.
Yeah. Definitely. Let's see. So let's talk a little bit more about the think tank angle. So had you, I don't know a little bit about you personally. Had you tried to get into a think tank, or was that kind of where you were?
You apply, but there's all these competitions. They're going to pull from people from Georgetown American University, those type of places. Yeah, you got to really be in DC.
Right.
For me, it didn't make economic sense to stay in DC. I'm looking for a job after my internship, so I just decided to return home, and I finally have an opportunity, but it's abroad. Because everyone, like a master's degree, that's not going to really get you anywhere. You got to really have a PhD now.
You got to really.
So So now, well, what I'm doing it a little bit differently. I'm going abroad, gaining experience
Oh, okay.
abroad, and then I'll come back. And then they said they might help me get a PhD. So um, I have two places that I'm looking at in Eastern Europe. So
Yeah, it's interesting because I think you've gone a few steps further than me. My international relations professor back in my undergrad was like, I want you to be a writer. I want you to get into being a researcher and work for. She was a leftist, so she probably didn't want me to work so much for a think tank as much as a, you know, uh, she wanted me not in an academic context, but in more of a writer and international relations theorist or something like that. But didn't end up going that route. Ended up going to teaching. I still really like all that stuff, but it wasn't until recently that I came around to again after a few years or years of experience reading, teaching, I came back to take another class for my master's in international relations. And you and I started talking. You sent me some stuff, and I'm like, "Oh, these realists, they're better than I originally thought." On some of this stuff, there's actually quite a bit of non-interventionist. No, I'm not non-interventionist, but at least sympathetic to that position. They may want, okay, we'll get out of the country, but we're going to have the Navy around for offshore balancing or something. But they do acknowledge a lot of the problems um, of U.S.
well, because realists believe in anarchy, right?
Right,
Liberals, they want to subvert anarchy. So that's the main. I mean, I know some people are not going to agree with that, but in my impression of international relations, the Wilsonian neoliberals. When I say neoliberals, I mean the international context, not the economic context. But they want to subvert anarchy. They want to have it highly institutionalized. Cooperation forms regimes. Regimes form institutions, and those institutions become more and more powerful and take away state sovereignty.
right.
So
So, well, that what they want, and this is not in a conspiracy theories type of way, but they want a one world government in the sense of one of the things I always point out, and it probably pisses people off, but in a discussion board in classes that I'm in, is we talk about Thomas Hobbes, and he talks about, okay, well, man's in this state of war, and they're always so therefore you need this government also run by men to overawe and overpower anyone. I'm like, well, but if you follow that logic all the way up, you need a one world government. You can't have anarchy between the states, and that's what they're
but
um,
it's so flawed because if human nature is flawed, how can you have a moral government? It kind of seems weird. Because
right.
then
I
is
just had this discussion, a short paper I was writing, uh, where I took James Madison's quote, "If men are angels, no government would be necessary." And everyone is like, "Oh, that's so pithy, that's so great." And I called Madison the genius who was wrong about everything, because if human nature is the problem, which it is, we acknowledge that, and it does have you require some type of restraint. Um, we acknowledge that too. But he says if men are angels, no government would be necessary. Well, who's going to run the government? Men who aren't angels. I mean, and so how much power do you want to give them? And that's both nationally and internationally. How much can you do?
so
Um, can you explain a little bit, so just people maybe who watch this understand what we mean by when we say that, and it's fairly simple, but what we mean when we say that the system is anarchic, that it's a system of anarchy, because usually when people hear anarchy, in my experience, is when I start my government classes with 12th graders, I asked the question, "Is government necessary?" And we talk through this a little bit to define what government is, and that without fail, every class every year mentions the movie The Purge. They think it's without government there'd be no laws, be killing people. What do we mean when we talk about international
international anarchy.
anarchy?
Well,
Yeah,
so it's like what we have now. There's no world government, right? And generally, yes, there are some conflicts, but generally it's peaceful, right? I mean, just go to humanprogress.org and just look at how many people are no longer dying compared to the 50s.
right,
There's the anarchic system. There's balancing, so it prevents people from states from having hegemony for long periods of time. So, right when you have United States. Now you're seeing the rise of China to counterbalance against the United States. Or you look at the Middle East, Iran in its role in the wars with ISIS. They came and balanced against ISIS, and then that kind of creates this whole mess that Scott Horton kind of does a way better job of me explaining. Or you look at Europe, right? Russia and its role with Napoleon or even the Prussian armies and balance against that. And so in reality, anarchy is just the absence of government. There's still norms that exist, right? There's still international treaties that happen, but it's more done on a voluntary basis where states will cooperate with states that they want to work with instead of having this institutionalized system forcing people to do X, Y, and Z.
Right. So yeah, so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about anarchy. I had to explain that recently. We was having a conversation with my dad because what we mean by anarchy, and we get it. Sometimes it means chaos, but uh, he was saying I think he was saying something like I think any government is better than complete anarchy. And I said, well, but there are all kinds of anarchic uh, things going on. I mean, you and I talking today, there's no one making us do this. We're acting in a voluntary organized chaos, right? It's not like the government told us that you and I had to sit down and talk. And also that's how it is between states. That states are granted this sovereignty. Not that that we totally agree with the conception of a nation state as it stands, but the idea is that there's not one government telling another government what to do. And this is one of the things I bring up with students is how. So okay, you got to have laws, you got to have rule of law, which I agree with. How come you don't have to follow the laws of China? Well, because China's not your government. It's not it's not in your territory. It's not the nation state. But you don't care about following China's laws. Is it is life totally crazy because you're not following Chinese law? No, you have your own norms and things that you fall into and laws and things because you're in a different state.
There's
Um,
more to governance than just the government, right? You can have governance on a global scale, but not have to have this institutionalized system to be the enforcer of that. It can be voluntary.
right.
So it's very like I always try to view it more. You try to take Mises' human action and apply it on a global scale.
Right, absolutely, I agree. Um, So back to in the sense of primacy, what do you think? And I don't know exactly what I think about this either, but what do you think would have to occur for the system to change in the United States, where people with some anti-war sentiments are able to actually express their views and get them heard on the highest level? Do you think it's possible, or what? What do you?
That would require the entire national values and the culture of the U.S. to change.
Yeah.
So that's so it because in my opinion, we have a progressive liberal culture, and so everyone wants to do hashtag do something.
Right.
So it's activists on the domestic, activist abroad. So I don't see how people would want to have a more restraint. Then also you look at Chicago, I think Global Affairs survey, and they talked about how young people prefer restraint, but the only reason why they're for restraint is because they don't watch the news.
Right.
Then when they watch the news, then they become more and more. Oh, the United States needs to do X, Y, and Z. And the anti-war movement is mostly in the news. They have a lot of journalists that write for different websites, or they write on American conservatives. But even there, they lose the argument. There was this. I went to a debate. It was at a non-interventionist think tank, and they're debating primacy versus restraint. When they polled the crowd, the restraint people lost at the non-interventionist think tank.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, they're not. So even though it's morally right to have a more anti-war, non-interventionist restraint policy, that's the way that people are conveying the message isn't sticking to people, and so that's problem one. But then problem two is what I said: the national values. It is complete. that would fundamentally change how the United States views itself and the world. Because as a progressive liberal society, it's an activist society. So that would require a ton of change.
Yeah, it's exactly right. It's similar to what I was reading in Thomas Sowell, who foreign policy wise is probably more on the interventionist side. But Thomas Sowell, great writer, great economist, but he writes this book called Vision of the Anointed. I actually did a video on it yesterday, or posted it yesterday, and the idea is that there are kind of two visions of the world. There are two worldviews. There's the tragic vision that looks at kind of the limitations of human capability, and so they view things in a very limited way of what power can accomplish. And then there's the anointed vision, which is a very technocratic type of vision that sees things as a problem to be solved with enough time, power, resources, and with the right people in charge, that you just solve homelessness like a math problem. You just solve dictators and not having democracy, with putting together the right PowerPoint or something like that, and getting in there and with a plan to accomplish these things. And like you said, it's an interventionist society, that the idea of kids not watching the news, and I don't watch the news either. I read and do things, but I don't sit and watch Fox or MSNBC or something like that. But they see a school shooting, and their reaction is, okay, well, what can government do? Which is an easy position to have, in the sense, because all you have to say is the government needs to step in and do this, and granted that power. And also, so that's also the reality with um, foreign policy. Saddam Hussein is a bad guy. Well, what are we going to do about it? Well, I mean, when we were funding and supporting him against Iran in the 1980s in the war there, we weren't going to do anything about it. We were going to support him. But once it came to us wanting to go to war with him, he was the next Hitler. And we needed to take him out because he was a threat to American national security. What do you say to the idea of, because the idea of primacy is that the US has to maintain this power position for our own security, for our own safety? What do you think about that argument? That if the US didn't occupy this position in the world, someone else would fill the void. Someone else would, or more bad stuff would ensue because of that. What do you say about that?
I mean, I guess if we define safety, if you view it more, you believe the U.S. should be. You want liberalism to spread, sure, right? That is a threat to liberalism, right? You see, that was just topics of Eastern Europe and the Visegrad group countries. Would how should people respond to these illiberal Eastern Europeans? But it's funny. I think it's mostly just, I wouldn't say fear mongering. Yeah, there is some concern because people say, well, like at the debate, what happens if China becomes more of a geopolitical player, and then the norms are dictated by China? Yeah, that wouldn't be very good, but I don't see that happening. I see a more multipolar world or a bipolar world forming. So there's not going to just be this giant, China's going to have this military with its strong economy to take over the entire world. The United States, we have what, two oceans and then two relatively weak powers on our border. So is it really that much of a problem to have a more restrained approach? Because should we be providing security for Europe? No, they have all these universal health care, all these other social programs. They'll just have to divert those funds to providing their own security. That's
Right.
if they want to defend their country, let them defend their country. Same thing with Japan. If they want to defend Japan, let them defend Japan. The United States, why should it waste its blood on some foreign country that some people have never even been to? So I don't think it I think people are just kind of being fearful of what the world could be, thinking of it like in a cyberpunk world. Oh, if China takes over, this is how it's going to be. Well, maybe, but then also, do you think China's just going to come across the Pacific Ocean and invade the U.S.? That just seems like a stretch.
Right. Well, and like you say, we have two vast oceans on our side, and that's what often makes people kind of unaware of foreign policy in a lot of ways, is because we're geographically isolated from a lot of the places in the world we're intervening in most ways. Uh, so we're not likely to be invaded. We also have relative wealth and comfort here, and so the sense is why rock the boat. But on the other hand, people fear so much that if America wasn't holding this power position in the world globally, that we would be attacked more, or other people would uh, bandwagon against us, or whatever the case may be, or that bad people would take over in other places in the world. But I mean, that's just the reality. And what about the idea also of, what about our allies? Don't we owe it to our allies to be maintaining this position of protection? Now, I brought this up recently. I said, well, yeah, allies like Saudi Arabia, who we arm to, uh,
Also, you can just bring up Saudi Arabia with their human rights. You believe in liberal internationalism, well, then why cooperate with Saudi Arabia? It doesn't make sense.
right, absolutely.
So, and that the whole moral argument and the universalism kind of falls apart.
Right, but
You've also,
but people don't always have to be consistent. That's the thing, is they just have to feel it. And
but also with Europe, right? I mean, have they met the requirements for cooperating with the United States, right? They're just sitting back, or they're drilling with the Chinese. Well, are you our ally? Are you not? So,
yeah, all right. Well, that is liberal imagining, and that is grand strategy. Uh, Let me close out with this last quote from this article. No, the article is why Washington doesn't debate grand strategy. A pretty good article, like you said. It had some criticism, and it didn't get into the theoretical foundations necessarily of where this stuff comes from. I thought this article was probably the best for its footnotes. Actually, I think it has a section of footnotes that's about as long as the article, and those have been really good to go through and look at and print out in some cases. But this one talks about at the end here, the alternatives being so small that the non-intervention or restraint alternative is almost non-existent in American foreign policy. And it says only the richest, safest nations can persist in a foolish grand strategy without bothering to debate it. Do you want to comment just briefly as we
I
close
mean,
out here on that, or?
if you challenge it, then you must be this nationalist, or some bad guy who is immoral, who wants to allow slave states to exist. So it's you can't, unless society changes and the cultural values change. It's going to be hard to have a debate on these type of issues.
Yeah. Uh, how would I just thought of this question real quick here? How would you articulate? And I know I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit, and I'll try to do it as well. How would you articulate the case for non-intervention and restraint in foreign policy to your typical American person, whatever that means, in 30 seconds or so? How would you?
30 seconds.
How long was? What do you want, a minute or?
I don't know. It would all. It would first. It would depend on what do they value. Do they value this more universalistic view of the world? Then that
Sure.
would take a long time, because you would have to attack that at the core. We shouldn't have. We shouldn't go. Ironically, you're challenging universal morality in a way.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be doing all these things because even though you think it's moral, look at all these consequences that have happened around the world that's hurt us. Right? I mean, how much money the United States has spent in the Middle East or even in Europe and also in Asia when that money could have been spent in America, allowing people to prosper instead of throwing millions and billions into Afghanistan. Um, Also, I think if the person lived in the South, because most people in the South, they are the ones that are volunteering to go into the army. Like, do you really want your sons and daughters to go die for this reason that really isn't about the United States national interest and its security? Um, but also, because the problem with like the restraint, they kind of have this more argument. Well, it's just not a very efficient way for the U.S. to handle international security. Like, well, that's not a very good argument. I think the attacking it on the moral grounds of saying, look at all these different immoral things that have resulted from our interventions, that would be a more successful argument. But
Yeah.
the problem is we have people that do that, and yet, right, still people believe in this interventionist policy. So I don't know. I think it will be forced to change, not will willfully change.
Right. I think you're right. There will be some shock to the system. Probably our national debt will have something to do with it. There will be some shock to the system that doesn't allow something on the size and scale of the American military dominance to continue. It just won't be possible. But I think you're right. You got to make the moral argument for it, and and keep doing it. I was just thinking through how I would put it, and I would put it in the sense of just like I would with economics. Um, but I'm going to also state what my problem is with this argumentation. I would say that intentions do not necessarily match results, and that the unintended consequences have caused the moral failure of uh, deaths, civilian deaths, wasted money, wasted American lives, all at the cost of making us less safe, not more safe. On the other hand, that argument isn't effective
No,
because I use it in economics all the time, and people still want universal health care. They still want a minimum wage. They still want all these things that economically you can walk them through how it's going to get them the opposite result, but it has a potent moral argument to it. This is why Bernie Sanders is success or was successful at least back in 2016 in this populist movement. Not only because he was saying I'm going to give you free stuff, but he would make a moral case for what he was saying. So I kind of take it's like Gary North said once in a book that no, it was Christian economics in one lesson. He said that yeah, you can explain to people the unintended consequences, that intentions don't match results, but you got to come to it from a moral bumper sticker, real simple thing. And so he would say that, uh, mine is thou shalt not steal even by majority vote. Okay, well there you go. That makes a moral case and is very clear. But I don't know if we have one yet for foreign policy. I guess we'll have to be thinking
no,
about it. How you can say it in one bumper sticker sentence like that. And I usually hate bumper sticker stuff. I like to go on
no.
and lecture but you need something like that. So
Well, the other problem is because in a way you're arguing for pluralism instead of this universal morality. So that's kind
right,
of the other issue to have.
which we believe in. That's the problem. We believe in universal morality, but what we're arguing is to not try to gain it at gunpoint. So
Yeah,
I don't know. Maybe the gunpoint thing is. It depends on who you're talking to. My question was unfair in the sense that I asked you to talk to the typical American, but the typical American is very diverse in opinions. So talking to someone in the American South about non-interventionism is different sometimes than talking to a liberal in Southern California. So anyway, all right. Well, thanks for talking today. I hope this thing worked with the filming. I don't do any editing or anything. This is kind of just it. This low quality programming that people have come to love. The 2 or 3 views on my YouTube page or whatever it is. But so we'll see if this worked. In the last few minutes that we've been talking, I've been getting this poor connection thing. Have you been getting that?
No.
Okay. Well, so I can see myself in the little camera, but I haven't been able to see what's going on your end. But
Oh
anyway,
wow.
hopefully we got the audio. If you got that, then that's really all I care about. I don't have an editor or someone
Okay.
to handle
Yeah,
those
I
things.
see. Yeah, I see you perfectly fine. So
Okay. Well,
yeah.
but yeah, thanks for talking. Well, I'll send you a copy of this too once I get through with it, and you can have it as well. Okay.
Okay.
So this is
Thank you.
Kevin Doremus, right?
Doremus. Yes.
Doremus, talking about foreign policy. All right, I'll talk to you later.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.